All right. Good evening. My name is Marty McGarry. I'm a small cog in the Sierra Nevada Forum's wheel. We all welcome you to this evening's Sierra Nevada Forum, the truth about Carson City roads funding straight from the horse's mouth. The mission of Sierra Nevada Forums is to provide facts to the community on topics of importance to our community. Some of our topics are controversial, and we present the facts. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the League of Women Voters of Northern Nevada and the Capital Branch of AAUW and the Nevada Appeal. Our format is as follows. Our speakers, who are experts in their field and are peer-reviewed, will present information about the topic and will answer many questions we ask them ahead of time. As the experts are speaking, volunteers will circulate in the audience with index cards and pencils for you to use if you have any questions. Write one question on each index card, no limit to the number of questions. It will be collected and passed to our screening panel. They will eliminate duplications, provide the questions to the moderator, who will then ask the presenters to answer the questions. Other housekeeping, fire exits are here. Restrooms are to my left, out past the lobby. Just a reminder, please silence your cell phones. And as you do it, mark the date, save the date for our next forum, which is Tuesday, May 14th, U.S. Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Act dollars. Follow the money in Nevada. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Greg Novak, who's been on the Regional Transportation Commission since 2022. He will introduce the speakers and will be available for any RTC questions after the presentation. Greg is a peer-reviewed professional, an expert. He's retired after 46 years from the Federal Highway Administration. Greg?
Thanks for coming. I hope you can hear me. I'm Greg Novak. As they said, I retired from Federal Highways a few years ago. I moved to Carson City back in 1979. So besides working for Uncle Sam for a lot of years, I know quite a bit about Nevada and Carson City. But tonight we're supposed to be learning about local roads and all the funding options that are being considered for them. So we have some folks that are local experts that are actually working on all the background for this. And we have Darren Schultz, Public Works Director, and Chris Martinovich, Transportation Manager for RTC. So with that, we will start getting into our presentation. And as Marty said, when they're done with the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. So pay attention, maybe take some notes. They're going to cover quite a bit of material, but definitely write down your questions. And the whole purpose of this meeting tonight is an exchange of information. We have a bunch, but we don't know everything for sure. That's why we have these meetings, and a lot of decisions are still up in the air. We'll see how things turn out. So are you two ready for your tag team presentation? All right. Who would like to go? Who's going to go first here? All right, Chris is starting here.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight and looking forward to going through these topics. We do, I'll be honest, it's a little bit of a lengthy presentation. Some slides will be quick, some slides we'll spend a little bit more time on. A lot of background information we want to present and provide that depth of knowledge in the background before we get to some of the future funding mechanisms that have been considered to this point. So I will get started. I'm going to hope my clicker here works. And see, now it doesn't. All right, well, it looks like it's working, so we'll get started with what we do. And so just quick background, my name is Chris Martinovich, Transportation Manager, Carson City Regional Transportation Commission. Darren Schultz, Public Works Director, as well as Greg mentioned. So here we go, let's get started. I want to start off with what we do to begin with. The city is more than roads. There's a number of functions that Public Works in particular is responsible for. And many of those are listed here on the screen. Anything from pavement maintenance, which is the focus of our local road funding initiative, but as well as road reconstruction, accessibility, street sweeping, snowplow removals. We also are responsible for landscaping and public spaces. We're responsible for traffic operations, sidewalk management, and we're also responsible for transit. So while the focus definitely is roadway funding, pavement preservation, pavement reconstruction, there's a lot that goes into the transportation and the street operations functions at Carson City Public Works. The first slide, I think it's important, is to provide a little background on the term functional classification. So essentially, roads are officially classified in a variety of functional classifications. They're listed there on the screen: freeway, expressway, principal arterial, minor arterial, collector, major and minor, and local. Those are divided up in two subgroups: regional roads, which are considered collector and arterials, and local roads, which is everything less than a collector and arterial. These roads are the responsibility of NDOT. We don't own, we don't maintain, we don't operate any roads in those first three functional classifications. These roads that are classified as minor arterial, collector, or local are the responsibility of Carson City, and it's important to make that distinction as we go through the presentation, because we're not going to talk about freeways, expressways, or principal arterials. Those are roads like I-580, South Carson Street past the Costco down there. Principal arterial is US 50 out from I-580 out toward Lyon County into Dayton. Those are examples of those types of roads. We don't own those roads. But all the other roads, minor arterial, collector, and local, we do own and we are responsible for. Arterials are things like Carson Street downtown, William Street in the downtown portion by Mills Park. Collectors are a little bit smaller roads, things like Mountain Street or Colorado Street. They sort of collect the neighborhood streets, the local roads. And then everything else is the local roads. That's where the majority of residents live, and that's where, again, our focus of our local road funding initiative, we'll talk more about briefly. But if you hear those terms, that's what we're talking about. So I want to talk about what the problem is. Specifically, and I'm just going to pause a second. Is this working or are you clicking them? I'll wave from now on. We wanted to talk about what the problem is. And so specifically, if we continue down the path that we're on with our current funding and the funding we've received historically, the pavement condition in Carson City is going to look like this. There's a lot of red, and red is bad. Green is good, blue is the best, but red is bad. And so we're looking in 2050, the year 2050, that over 70% of our roads will be considered very poor. 19% will be considered serious, and a total of about 5% of all the roads in Carson City will be completely failed, basically, essentially a glorified gravel road is what we're talking about, a failed road. And I'm going to go into this a little bit more in detail here just as we get going. But I think it's important to understand, how did we get here? What's happened over the years? Why are we suddenly short of funding? What's changed? Well, this graph shows three lines. The red line is the fuel revenue that we've received since 2000. It's not the dollar amount, it's the percentage change. So if we received $1 in 2000, then the percentage change is 25% more in 2022. So it's the percentage change over time. So we receive approximately 25% more fuel, gas tax, diesel tax revenue than we did in 2000. We also have additional miles of road in Carson City than we had in 2000 for a variety of reasons, but the number of city-owned streets has increased by 28% since 2000. But the green line there is the one that I'll call your attention to, and that's the cost of constructing those roads. So over that same 22-year period, the cost of construction has increased 123% as compared to the revenue generation of around 25%. So you can see that the cost of doing the same things is costing more than it did in 2000. And that's really the crux of the problem, is that our revenue isn't keeping up with the cost of construction. I also want to talk a little bit about why roads fall apart. Roads fall apart for a number of reasons. They fall apart for weather conditions, things like water getting into the cracks of the pavement or getting under the soil conditions. Temperature causes roads to deteriorate. When it gets hot, sometimes the roads deflect. and they start to what's called rutting, and I'll go into that. When it gets cold, we see thermal cracking, which is the cracks that form across the pavement, and you see those when you drive down the road, and they get wider and wider over time. Also, we have a very dry climate, and so what happens is the oils actually in the asphalts begin to dry out, and when the oils begin to dry out, the pavement begins to physically shrink. And as that oil degrades over time, the roads start to deteriorate, and we start to see more and more cracks. Another factor is vehicle use and loading. Roads, can change volume over time. New development occurs, changes in the land use occur, and we start to see more traffic, more different types of vehicles using the road. And so that can degrade roads, especially if the water and the soil condition starts to fail as well. Heavier vehicles such as a truck or other large vehicles, coupled with weather conditions, cause roads to fail. Soil conditions, I mentioned, if we have bad ground underneath, that's an issue. And then cuts and patches can cause premature failure of roads when they're not replaced properly. So the takeaway here is that even with no traffic use, roads continue to and will fail over time regardless of anybody ever driving on them. How do pavements fall apart? Well, I think we're all familiar with potholes. Those are pretty common. Those are caused by wet conditions and vehicle loading. A number of cracking conditions can occur on our roads. There's three main types: thermal cracking, block cracking, and alligator cracking. And those are quasi-technical terms, but there's some pictures of what a typical thermal crack looks like up there. And anyone who's driven on any road probably is familiar with those and knows what they sound like when you drive on them. Block cracking are what we commonly see where you have like block-shaped cracks all over the road, and that's an indication of pavement shrinkage in some part. Alligator cracking is when we see fatigue, and then you can see that in the lower picture there on the lower, right side of your screen, left of mine, where you can see the alligator cracking there. That's also a good indication of rutting, where, like I mentioned, the soil conditions, the heat conditions combine, and you get actual ruts forming in the asphalt pavement. So that happens. The last condition that we often see is raveling, and it's sort of hard to see on the picture, but that's where the surface of the asphalt the oil starts to dissipate, and you're left with these, coarse aggregates on the surface. And you've probably all seen that. It makes a very rough surface, a lot of friction, great for stopping, but poor for soil conditions. The water tends to sit in there and degrades the road faster. So that's what we call raveling. So those are some of the common ways that we see our pavements here in Carson City failing, and those are the things we're working to address, through different maintenance and repair and reconstruction procedures going forward. So we measure pavement failure on what's called a pavement condition index, and this is a typical life curve of a piece of road in Carson City. All pavements, when they're freshly paved, start out with a pavement condition index, or PCI, of 100. And over time, they degrade to eventually something near zero. And so I mentioned earlier in that slide where we have, 71% of our roads are going to be very poor. So you can see how low of a pavement condition index that actually is on this pavement curve. This curve changes over time. It changes based on road. It changes based on location of this in the city. Some roads we have in Carson City go back to the Ormsby County days, and so we've gotten a long pavement life out of those. Other ones are newer, and they've fallen apart, more quickly. And it all depends on how they, degrade across this curve. But all pavements over time degrade similar to this curve as shown on the screen. How do we know what our pavement condition is? How do we know what pavement, where it falls onto that curve? How do we know what we need to do in each of our roads? Well, we conduct every few years a physical pavement survey. And this is actually completed with a truck that drives around on all of our roads and measures all the different distresses. I don't know if I should say if this is the exact number, but I think there's 17 different distresses these trucks can measure. In addition to those cracks and those rutting and that raveling that I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of other things they're scaling and analyzing with this vehicle. And all that data is compiled and collected and put into a pavement management software that's called Paver. It's a nationally accepted pavement asset management software, and we use it to not only track the condition of our pavement, but model future conditions over time. And I'll touch on that in a moment. As I mentioned, we include every single segment of publicly owned paved road in Carson City. We assign a PCI. This truck and this survey assigns a PCI to every segment of road, and each segment is basically more or less a block. some of the blocks in Carson City, as I'm sure you know, are very, very small, so we don't have that many segments of those super small blocks, but generally a segment is a block of road, and so we measure every block of pavement. And based on that, we can predict future conditions based on that performance curve. We can estimate that over time, what that pavement's going to do based on that performance curve I showed in the previous slide. So just a visual here of network conditions of Carson City's roads. This is as of spring of 22 when we completed our last physical survey of the roads. Our regional roads, those collectors and arterials, had a pavement condition of 74. That was a 10% increase from the previous pavement condition of 2017. Our local roads saw a 9% decrease of 56, and so an average, citywide average, is at 62 as of the last completion of our last survey in 2022. And that's what the graph looks like. So a lot more yellow and orange and green than that version I showed a second ago in 2050. So how do we fix these roads? What do we do about maintaining our roads? What are the steps that we can take? So there's four main steps that we take, and there are four main steps that go into the paver analysis that we analyze for options for fixing our roads. The first is what we call stopgap, and this is basically crack sealing. We're going through, and our street operations crews do this on an annual basis. They'll go out and they'll clean out a bunch of cracks, and they'll put in a crack sealer and some other miscellaneous patching. Pothole repair also falls into this stopgap item, and that's basically, sort of the initial. We want to stop the pavement from failing quicker, so we go out and we do those preservation treatments. Then we get into the preventative side of things, and these are where we do our slurries and our surface treatments. These are essentially oil and small aggregate surface treatments that we sort of pour onto the pavement, and they're spread out with a machine. That's common. Contractors do that for us commonly in Carson City, and that really solves issues such as raveling. It also solves some of the larger I'll say some of the smaller cracking issues that we see. So we do that on a preventative maintenance to keep our good roads good and preserve that PCI longer. Then we have the next one's rehabilitation. This is more traditional mill and overlay, where you mill off or you remove a thin section of pavement and you put back a new layer of pavement. That works in some applications. It doesn't work in all applications, but it's a good sort of mid-range cost treatment to make the roads last longer. And then lastly is full reconstruction, where you're essentially removing and replacing the entire pavement and putting back brand new paved asphalt in that on our roads. So what does that mean in terms of dollars and cents? Well, if we look at that performance curve, again, with the pavement condition index on the vertical axis and the life of the pavements on the horizontal axis, a new pavement is in blue. And so that's the expected life that we would see out of a typical pavement. When we do preventative, it's a relatively cheap way of refreshing our pavement, but you have to do that earlier in the life of the pavement, because as you go down that curve, the treatments such as rehabilitation and reconstruction become more and more expensive. So you can do more with less dollars on the preventative side than you can on the reconstruction side, because as the pavement ages, there's no point of putting a slurry on it if it's full of cracks, and that slurry is just going to go through those cracks. So that's kind of the background and how we understand and how we think about the different costs associated with the different ages of pavement. So I want to go back into the modeling side of things and talk a little bit more about that. So our paver database takes those four conditions: stopgap, rehabilitation, preventative, and major reconstruction, and analyzes all of the roads in Carson City. And there's costs applied to those, each of those, and they're listed there on the screen. And so we input those costs based on the prices that we're receiving, the cost that we have at Carson City. We input those into the database, and it does an iterative process, looking back and forth at every segment of road. What do I need? Can I do this? Where can I do it? How about this one? And it bounces around the entire city's network, every one of those segments that we've surveyed, and picks and chooses the roads that will best meet two criteria. Criteria one is, do we want to set a target condition? For instance, we want to keep all of our roads in the exact same condition that they're in today. Paver's going to say, okay, I want to meet a PCI of 62, and I'm going to look at all the road segments over a given time, and I'm going to try to pick the right ones to get you a PCI of 62 in year one. Then in year two, I'm going to do all those roads again, and I'm going to analyze them all over again. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to do these to get you a PCI in year 62 in year two. So that's method one. Method two is we could program an available budget where we say, well, we got $10 million every year. Paver, you go in, taking the conditions of our road, and pick all the roads that get us to $10 million year one, $10 million year two, $10 million year three. So there's different scenarios that we can run in the pavers database based on our target, what we want to get out of it. And those are the two we've used to this point. And so if we go to the next slide, this is an example of some of the data that comes out of paver. And these change every time we do a new road, we reconstruct a road, we preserve a road, we update our paver database. And so these results are really a snapshot in time. If we go in tomorrow and we update our paver database, then this table is going to look different because it's iterating between all the roads in Carson City and finding the best group that gets us there. But essentially what this is saying is in 24, the paver database is analyzing that we are going to preserve 48 miles of road at a cost of $7.5 million. We're going to rebuild 5 miles of road at a cost of $13 million. So we can deliver 53 miles of treated road for a cost of around $24.7 million. And it's this sort of process, particularly that column on the right side of the screen, where the total column, where you can see that's the basis for our funding gap that we've discussed. You know, if many of you have come to meetings before, that's the basis of the funding gap. That's the basis of the $25 million per year, is the iterative table of all the improvements, major reconstruction, rehabilitation, slurry, stopgap, all of that is where that number comes from. And like I said, it's bouncing and picking and choosing roads every year based on the need across the city. In this case, our goal was maintain current condition. So paver said, okay, I want to maintain 62. I'm going to take all the roads. This is the cost to maintain a current condition of a 62. If we go to the next slide. We ran different scenarios, and this is all available on our website and in a report that we generated. We ran different scenarios. We ran current revenue. So we said, paver, we only get this much money. What does it look like over time? That's how we got to that original red pie chart at the beginning of the screen. The yellow line, the gray line there is the maintain current condition. So again, we programmed paver to say we want to do 62, and it went through the process, and that's why those lines at the top are relatively horizontal, as we had programmed a target condition. We wanted to maintain some target condition, versus the two lines at the bottom, which show it kind of parabolically dropping over time. So that's sort of the background of paver. We are going to work on some more additional information. If anyone has any more questions about paver, we can put together some information and get that out if need be. Go ahead and go to the next one. So what does that look like in terms of dollars and cents? Again, this is the basis of our $25 million. There, the gray column in the middle, to maintain the current condition of a PCI of 62. That's the summary over the 30-year period, 28-year period from 2022 to 2050. That's the average annual cost to maintain our roads in that condition. Different conditions and different scenarios are shown there on the screen, but we're focusing on that gray one at this time. So back to this chart, same one I showed earlier. Current PCI degrading down to 2050, we would be looking at a citywide average of a PCI of 33 with our current revenue projection using our paver database and our current road network. So with that, I am going to take a break and turn it over to Darren. He's going to take us through a little bit of the past funding for roads in Carson City, and then I'll be back to talk about current funding and what we're doing in the future.
All right, thank you, Chris. Really good to be here. Thank you for having us. We really do geek out on this stuff, and we love it. But I do understand that it could put some of you to sleep, but we'll try to keep that to a minimum. But we are specifically trying to cover a lot of material tonight to give you an oversight of everything that goes on with street funding and the pavement here in Carson City. So please pardon the amount of information coming at you. We tried to keep it at high level, but we really wanted to start from the beginning and go forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit just about some of the history as it relates to streets, because we get a lot of questions about that, of really how we got where we are now. So next slide, please. So our city budgets include the two funds. The one is the RTC and the other is the street maintenance fund. Those are the funds that control all of the streets in Carson City. Our RTC fund is made up of the fuel and diesel tax. Those are the primary funding source. 9 cents per gallon in gas, 5 cents per gallon on diesel. That's established. That's what it is today. For the street maintenance fund, we have the motor fuel tax, 6.35 cents per gallon. And then we have, on top of that, we have sales tax, which is 0.25%, citywide sales tax and use tax. That fluctuates depending on how much people buy in Carson City, both residents and visitors. Next slide. So this is just an overview of breaking up those taxes. We get people that want to know about how this was done. So the original 5.35 cents sales gas tax, that was mandated by NRS. That's across the state of Nevada. And then these additional gas taxes, as you can see the years as to when those were added for Carson City. That's just our county as to when those were added. So as you can see, for gas taxes, the last one was 1997, and that was an additional 5 cents. The diesel tax was more currently, many of you will remember that, so that was in 2022 that a 5-cent diesel tax was added. So those are the dates, that's the last time those taxes were touched in Carson City. Next slide. So this is just a little bit of an example. Chris talked about it, but it kind of puts it in perspective in terms of part of the problem of why we can't fund our streets. So in 2000, we paid $1.25 per gallon of gas. Of that $1.25, 15.35 cents went to taxes, gas taxes for Carson City. Now, if you go out and you buy a gallon of gas, it costs $4.25. But guess what? The same amount of tax that you were paying in 2000, that's the same as it is today. So that $3 increase in gas, none of that, there's no additional funding coming to Carson City for streets or roads. It's the same amount as was being collected back in 2000. So it's something to kind of help, and that's our message here of partly how we got to where we are, is there's been no, the gas has went up, we all know that at the pump, but there's been no increase to the tax that's collected. Next slide. So this is just for your information. It affects us when we buy gas at the pump, but very little, it's not a lot of this money comes back to us. So this is state and federal collected tax on gasoline that you buy at the pump. So just for information. So this is an overview of the sales tax portion, which I mentioned goes to help fund street maintenance. So in 1986, this was approved by the voters, and it was 0.25% sales tax for street maintenance. The total sales tax in Carson City is 7.6%. So I've also included all the other things that are funded by sales tax in Carson City to get to that 7.6%. And as you can see, 0.25 is what goes towards street maintenance of that overall picture. So here in Carson City, we're at 7.6%. Next slide. So this is just a graph to show what the surrounding counties, all the counties actually in Nevada, pay for sales tax. So it kind of gives you an idea of where we fall. We're obviously quite a bit lower than Washoe County and Clark County, our big populaces in the state, but we're also quite a bit higher than some of the more rural counties. That kind of is to be expected, but just a general overview in case you didn't know what different counties pay. So a little bit of other revenue sources that come in. I've talked about the sales tax, I've talked about the gas tax. So other revenues that come in to help fund our roads. So waste management fee. This was enacted by our Board of Supervisors in 2019 when we did our new contract for waste management services here in Carson City. And that generates approximately $360,000 a year. The V&T fund. So the V&T fund was established, and you saw that earlier as part of the tax, the total sales tax that we had. There was contribution for the V&T railroad. And what's happened over time is we've collected additional funds compared to the bond payment that is required to be paid off for that V&T railroad. So back in 2018, the Board of Supervisors said, well, any additional money that is collected in that tax that's not required for the V&T, let's take that and let's put that to roads. So that generates about $425,000 a year. And then the BOS allocates additional general fund towards roads most years from previous year's savings. So depending on where we finished last year and how taxes came in as compared to our budget, what's different there, some of that funding is then moved for the next year that can be contributed to roads. That varies every year as things ebb and flow. It's not a number we can count on, but obviously we're thankful for every penny that we can get. And then they contributed $2.5 million in our ARPA funding that we got for Carson City. That went to roads, and those projects are all under design right now. But that's gonna help some of our maintenance of some of our roads. And then we are always going after federal and state grants. This is not something that we should not pay attention to. We're very successful at it. We have good, talented people that go after it. And if you average out the last 10 years, we've been able to win approximately $3 million per year just from federal or state grants. That is money that is used in our transportation system. Next slide. So here, I kind of wanted to just talk about the discussion portion of road funding in Carson City. And I just kind of looked approximately over the last 10 years, because I don't want anybody to think that this is a new problem, and I don't want anybody to think that this is the first time we've brought this forward and we've discussed it, because that's just not the truth. So the funding issue has always been there, but it's definitely gotten worse over the last 10 or 15 years. During this time, the gap between roadway funding available, that's the money that's coming in, that has been coming in, compared to the cost of actually doing the repairs, that gap has grown exponentially. So it's made the problem way, way worse than it was, even though we've always had a problem. The RTC and the Board of Supervisors recognized the problem and directed staff to create a working residents committee and look for possible solutions. So this was done in approximately 2015. So a group, local group was established of residents and businesses to talk about this problem and to come up with solutions and where are there opportunities to try and minimize this problem. So at that point, there was a number of public meetings. This committee met, I think 5 or 6 times. Feedback was going back and forth to RTC as well as the Board of Supervisors. And it was determined that the best solution was to index our fuel tax. So basically what that is the fuel tax that is already mandated that I showed you earlier, you index that. And that is what indexing is, basically an inflation factor. So if inflation goes up 2%, the gas tax would go up 2% that year. The next year, if inflation goes up 3%, the gas tax would go up 3%. So that was determined that was the best method to bring forward. And that was, part of that was, it was allowed through the state legislature. A number of the counties got involved, and the state legislature changed the law to say counties can do this. The state legislature didn't go so far to say you should do this to raise money. They said every county can do it, decide if they want to do it or not, but they allowed that. Prior to that, it wasn't allowed, except for special circumstances for Washoe County and Clark County. So that was the solution that was decided on during that time, which was 2015, 2016. So that measure of indexing our fuel tax, that went to the ballot in 2016. that ballot measure did not pass in Carson City. So that effort, we were talking about it, we were explaining the problem, we were bringing that forward, we got community involved, got all our elected involved. That was at that point, this is a solution we should try, let's put it on the ballot. It didn't work. So once that was done, then direction was given to staff. Let's focus on the funding that we currently have and prioritize projects with best practices. This resulted in funding primarily going to arterials and collectors. So that's what Chris was talking about. When you don't have enough funding to do all your roads, then you start, the idea was, well, take the funding we have and let's spend it on the most bang for your buck road in Carson City. So because of that, the majority of people drive on collectors and arterials. The majority of people do not drive on a neighborhood street, so a local road. So because of that, the funding shifted to where the majority of it by far was spent on collectors, arterials. We were protecting those, we were upgrading those, we were making those, trying to keep the index of those roads, the condition of those roads as high as possible because that's where the most people were driving. Arterials, collectors, 30% mileage, 70% traffic. Local roads just in reverse, those are give and take. So once we shifted, as you might guess, the majority of our resources to those roads, then the local road complaints started to come back and with more because I get it, the street out in front of your house, very bumpy, very potholed. You haven't seen any repairs out there. So we started getting complaints there. So then we were directed again in 2021 to go back and start researching again alternative methods for additional funding to help fund this gap. So that brings us to, next slide, where we are today, and Chris will walk us through that.
Thank you, Darren. So I'm going to go back into a little bit more specific. We're going to get very specific in terms of revenue generated, and we're looking specifically at fiscal year 23. All the numbers here are going to kind of vary over time. They vary year to year, but I wanted to really focus in on the most recent audited available financial data that we've generated. So the next slides are really focused on fiscal year 23. But just for a perspective here, this chart shows the tax collected, diesel tax and gasoline taxes collected, as well as the total revenue generated from those the past 5 years. So in 2019, we received $5.9 million from these three funding sources, fuel tax funding sources. In 2023, we received $6.4 million from those funding sources. So about $500,000 more in that 5-year period. You can see in 2020, it was a slight decrease as everybody was probably not driving in Carson City at that time for those few months during the pandemic. What does that look like in terms of revenue splits? So these are the primary revenue sources from local sources here in Carson City. 58% of our roads that go to the street operations and the Regional Transportation Commission comes from the fuel taxes, diesel and gasoline. 35% comes from the sales tax, the 0.25% sales tax. V&T that Darren mentioned, the bond payments, that makes up about 4%, and then 3% generally comes from the waste management franchise fee, again, that Darren mentioned. It doesn't include federal funds in this pie chart or other sources. Next slide. This is a funding source. This is a graph that does show the other funding sources. This is all the funding sources received in fiscal year 23 that go to either the street operations or the Regional Transportation Commission for all functions within those two divisions of Public Works. Gasoline tax was $5.8 million. Sales tax was $3.9 million. The diesel tax, breaking that out separately, and this graph was $662,000. We received approximately $500,000 in federal funding revenue that particular fiscal year. As Darren mentioned, some years we've got multiple millions. This year was particular year was 500 received. Other funds, this is interest, rent, gifts, donations, anything else, it totaled $434,000. V&T sales tax in 23 generated $427,000. And the waste management franchise fee generated $361,000. Again, specific to fiscal year 23, these do vary year to year. Go ahead. Where does that money go? This is sort of a breakdown of where that funding goes, where it gets distributed. 6.4 million in 23 went to the Street Operations Division. You can see the breakdown of those sources listed there. The Regional Transportation Commission received $6.11 million in fiscal year 23. You can see those breakdowns there on that side of the screen. In total, revenue for local sources, local only, was $11.7 million. When you add in that federal, it brings it up to the $12.2 million, again, for fiscal year 23 specifically. Darren mentioned other sources. So an example here on the left side of the screen include the general fund transfers that we've been fortunate enough to get over the years. Surface transportation block grants, community development block grants, transportation alternative grants, RAISE grants. These are all federal funding grants. They're discretionary. They're not necessarily automatic. We have to apply for them and be awarded the funds. There's a process for doing that. Safety grants, congressional earmarks. We've been successful recently in getting a number of congressional earmarks from our congressional delegation. Senator Rosen, Cortez Masto, and Congressman Amodei have been lobbying for that. And then our Federal Transit Administration, from the FTA, we've been getting funds to do some sidewalk and some other work as well for those activities. Good and bad with those funding sources. One, that they have the potential of generating high generation of revenue. Our Tiger and our Raise that we received for South Carson and William, those were 7.6, 9.3, I mean, large multi-million-dollar grants. They can fix large sections of road at one time, but they're project specific. They're awarded to a specific project. They can't be used globally in most cases. They're not always reliable, as has been mentioned. Comes with a little bit more effort. There's more staff involvement. There's some additional strings, but they're a good funding source, and we can continue to strategically pursue them where we think we can win and we can be successful, rather than just spending the time on everything and not winning anything. We want to be strategic and try to win what we can win. Go ahead. So a further breakdown, this is the expense side of things. So we had the revenue earlier. This is the expense side, the pie chart there. The revenues in the pie chart, the expenses are in the boxes. Total expenses in fiscal year 23 were $11.5 million of all those funding sources. $6.3 million was spent by the Street Operations Division, and $5.2 million was spent by the Regional Transportation Commission Division. So the breakdowns are there. The little boxes is probably hard to see, but this will be on their website, and we'll also have the slides available after. But the breakdown of those funding expenditure side of things, I should say, is listed on this screen. A number we've often used is $4.5 million available for funding projects. And so I want to take a moment and sort of explain how that number comes to be. You see the revenue of $12 million. Well, why are you only saying there's $4.5 million for projects? Well, that's because a lot of our revenue goes to things like snow plowing. That's not necessarily a capital project. That's not a preservation type project. Right-of-way maintenance, other elements of the street operations does, purchasing of vehicles to do the work. Of course, staffing and administration costs for the city staff as well. So when we back all those out, we end up with these primary sources. A good portion of the staffing, about 30% is what we estimate, of staffing costs from the Street Operations Division does do specific street functions, crack sealing, pothole filling, some of those basic functions that we do, signing and striping, things like that we can do in-house at the city. A portion of those costs are captured. Pavement and concrete work. So this is replacing of driveways and sidewalks and curb ramps that our internal street crews do and manage and pay for. We also have signing and striping. That's our long line and our short line, which means the road, the lines and pavement markings and the signs on the side of our road. Those are all done by primarily our street operations crews, and there's a cost associated with doing all those things. So we capture that as well. And then the capital project side, which comes out of the Regional Transportation Commission, are the major rehabilitation, preservation type projects. And so in fiscal year 23, this is generally the breakdown. On average, it can vary year to year. I think if you added up all those numbers, it's around 4.2, 4.3 million. Some years it comes out to be 4.6, 4.7. But when you average it over time, it's around 4.5 million in available funding directly to pavement-related type projects. Go ahead and change it. So that's how we get the funding gap that we've been talking about if you've attended our previous meetings. We take the 25 million, that gray bar we discussed earlier, we take out the 4.5, and that creates a funding gap of $21 million. So that's generally how the funding gap was identified through those two equations. What does $4.5 million get us? What can we do with that money? Darren mentioned how we're prioritizing roads to regional roads instead of local roads. So we have 286 paved miles of road in Carson City. Of those, 203 are local, classified local roads, and 83 are classified as regional, collector and arterials. Of that 83 miles, that 4.5 in fiscal year 2020, this is in 2022, all the numbers haven't been crunched for 23 yet, but for 22, we were able to complete 3.9 miles of road for that $4.5 million, leaving all of the rest of the roads that year generally untouched. No, we did some striping, we did some signing, but generally the roads were untouched. And so that's where we are, and that's the reason we see that pavement degrading to that PCI of 30 that I highlighted earlier. So what are we going to do about that? What's the next steps? And so this is where we're really focusing now on going forward. And so Darren mentioned in 2021, we kicked off a campaign project to do outreach and education about how we're funding, how we're maintaining what we do for our roads. That's part of tonight's presentation and all the presentations we've done. The website, which we're actively updating, the majority of the updates have been made, preservecarsoncityroads.com. I will probably get this presentation up there as well as another media distributions for tonight's meeting. But there'll be graphics and figures, and the text will be updated here shortly. We've had a number of workshops related to this in October and March, and there's been a number of presentations given to the RTC and the Board of Supervisors on this particular topic over the course building that story. Go ahead. A bunch of mechanisms have been looked at. Darren mentioned fuel indexing, but many others were looked at as part of this project and sort of aside to this project. The new diesel tax, excellent, that was passed. Gasoline tax, Darren mentioned that. We looked at a property tax override, essentially increasing the property taxes and assigning a portion to that toward roads, local roads in particular. Local improvement districts authorized under state law 271, a general improvement district, special purpose transportation sales tax, so that's another sales tax. The infrastructure sales tax was the one was highlighted on V&T, and I'll go into a few of these more in detail in a moment. We looked at creating a transportation utility, similar to your water, sewer, stormwater. Can we create a utility for your road? It serves your house just like your pipes do under your house. Is that an option? What does that look like? We looked at a government services tax. This is something that's applied on your vehicle registration, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Becoming more and more nationally studied and as a national option is a road user charge. As we see fuel taxes degrading, as we see alternative fuels powering our vehicles, not purchasing gasoline anymore, how do we change the model to ensure we have revenue generated for roadways in the future? So nationally and at the state level, they've been looking at what's called a road user charge, where you pay essentially by the mile or some similar option. So we looked at that to see if that was an option for us. And then we've got a lot of questions on the marijuana tax. Why there's marijuana dispensaries in Carson City. Can that money be used and distributed? The short answer is no. That's generally governed by the state, and so we're not capable of getting that sales tax under the current structure that we can use to roads. So a few of these have moved forward. A few of them have been backed off. The gas tax, that didn't move forward. Property tax override, that hasn't moved forward. Transportation utility, there's really no state enabling law, so we'd have to create state law to be able to do that, so that's not being analyzed right now. Road user charge, lots of things to work out. I think that's going to be bigger than Carson City. That's going to be a state or a national thing, so there's a lot of conversations happening at those levels, not necessarily appropriate for today for Carson City. I'll go ahead and go forward. So what are we looking at? So there was a presentation back in, I want to say, late 21, early 22, to the Board of Supervisors, seeking direction on which of these options we should continue to dive deeper into, which ones are good options for us to consider and get more information on. These are the four that were outlined: local improvement districts, general improvement district, or GID, special purpose transportation sales tax, so new sales tax, the V&T, continuation of the infrastructure sales tax that was paid for the V&T. A government services tax has come along a little bit later. It was initially screened out by the Board of Supervisors. There was concern that maybe it didn't generate enough revenue, maybe it needed a vote. A lot of discussion at that meeting, but through some additional research, it's sort of been discovered that maybe this still is a good option. So we kind of resurrected that and wanted to continue that in further detail. And so we've been working with a consultant to evaluate these and understanding how much revenue each mechanism could generate and how they can be leveraged together or separately, and different scenario plannings going forward. So we've been working on that for the last couple of years. Go ahead. Thank you. So let me go into the details of these and just a little bit more for background of those basically 5 mechanisms we're looking at. The first is the local improvement district. I'm not going to read everything on here, but this is essentially a small localized group of members of the community, neighbors, businesses, whoever, get together, identify a need, identify a project, come to the city, or the city initiates itself and says, we want to do this project. Everybody in that's affected by that project essentially pays a portion of the cost. They all pay their individual share of that toward the cost of the project. The project gets built. When the project's completed, the bills are paid. The district essentially ends and goes away. So it's very piecemeal, very spotty, but it could be a mechanism to address some of the issues. The second mechanism is the infrastructure sales tax. This is what's generally the V&T sales tax. So it's an existing sales tax of 1/8%, 0.125%. This is currently, as Darren described, is repaying the bonds, and those bonds are slated to be repaid around 25, 26 is my understanding. And then that money could be available to be redirected entirely to roads if directed to do so and if approved to do so. So that could generate around $2 million in the future, as right now we're getting around $450,000 to $500,000 per year from that. So it has the potential to generate around $2 million in the future. Special purpose sales tax could be another option. We have a few sales taxes Darren outlined earlier, so this would be a new 0.25%, 0.25% sales tax in Carson City, specifically for the construction, maintenance, and repair of public roads. We know what this would generate because we have sales taxes in place for this similar amount. So generally $4 to $4.5 million per year is the revenue potential on this mechanism. The RTC recently recommended to the Board of Supervisors that this option be placed on the November 24 ballot, and so the Board of Supervisors, pending that decision, could place this question on the ballot in November of 24. So more to come on that. Supplemental government services tax. This is one of the other ones we were looking at that was, like I mentioned, resurrected. Essentially, this is a new 1% tax on the value of vehicles when they're purchased. It would be applied to any vehicle registered in Carson City. It starts out at a maximum of 1%. Well, the math is here on the screen, but essentially if you buy a $50,000 vehicle, year one, you'd pay $50,000 times the statutory maximum times the 1 cent. You'd pay about $175 per year on that registration. It depreciates over time so that the vehicle gets older. There's a minimum threshold, and the minimum threshold is at year 9 and any year after that. So that same vehicle, 9 years later, would essentially pay around $26 per year for that government services tax. So that's how a government services tax generally at high level works. We think through some coordination with the DMV and the number of registered vehicles in Carson City would generate around maybe a little over $2 million a year in new revenue through this source. So that's definitely one considering going forward. And then the last mechanism we were looking at is what's called the General Improvement District, or GID. And essentially this one is a new separate government agency solely for the maintenance and repair of roads. The interesting thing with the GID is it's set up and can be set up and must be set up for specific purposes. It can never do more than what it's set up to do, but it can do less. So if a GID was set up to plow roads, for instance, then that's all it could ever do. If a GID was set up to do road repairs and plow roads, then it could do either or those things, but it could never do more than those things. So it's a little bit of an interesting, it can be crafted specific to the needs at the time and the needs of the city's roads in the direction of the governing body and the Board of Supervisors. The revenue potential on this one really varies because of the different ways that a GID could be assessed. We've been using at our meetings and the information presented on the website sort of a theoretical dollar generation of around $5 million per year. But that amount could change. It could be higher, it could be less. It's just a number we've been using for illustrative purposes. But that revenue varies, and it holds a lot of flexibility and it holds a lot of potential for generating the most revenue of the mechanisms we've looked at. But there comes with some challenges with that, most notably cost to residents of Carson City. So That's the status on that one. We're still doing a little bit of research on this. There's still some, that assessment methodology still needs to be sort of worked and figured out before we have any sort of formal recommendation or summary on this. So definitely more to come on the General Improvement District later this summer. Just a quick summary of the 5 mechanisms we've been looking at. This is just a summary of that for background purposes and those wanting to speed through the presentation later. This is a summary of the revenue potential shown by each of the improvements. So the local improvement districts, really it's project by project. Could be a small project, could be a big project, really unknown. But all the other ones are listed there on their revenue potential. So what's next? We're looking, the Board of Supervisors is going to consider the placement of these sales tax and the government services tax on the ballot and on November 2024 ballot. We're also compiling the results of our previous public workshop back in March. We're finalizing those results from the GID and getting those final thoughts together and that final report for the GID, as well as all the funding mechanisms. We're wanting a summarized report for all of that. We're also developing scenarios for different project delivery. If we got $5 million, what does that mean in terms of how much project, what does our road condition look like? If we get $20 million, what does our road condition look like? We're going to be looking at some of those different funding scenarios and see what that looks like over that 2050 period. And then the final summary and presentation will be made to the Regional Transportation Commission and the Board of Supervisors later this summer in 2024. My last section, I know it's a lot, I want to touch briefly on project selection. So there's a number of requirements we have to consider when we select what projects to do. If you're interested in what projects we are doing, I wanted to highlight that we do a project status report that's given to the RTC every other month, typically odd months. It's also posted online on our website, our Transportation Division website. We have a map as well. If you're interested and curious about what projects we're working on and where, those maps and those materials are online. We prioritize projects in Carson City primarily using what we call a district pavement management plan. So we divide the city up into 5 equal regions, equal by road mileage, generally speaking, not by size, but road mileage. And we rotate annually in each district our funding. So we prioritize funding in different regions of the city each year, and it rotates on a 5-year cycle. So right now in 2024, we're prioritizing projects in District 1. And we're on cycle 2. So we were there in 2017 on District 1 as well. Well, 2019, apologize, 2019. We look at all these factors, but ultimately our goal is, we know reconstruction is expensive. We've touched on that earlier. So we want to try to keep the good roads good. So that's been our goal to this point. You know, additional funding could change that goal, and we could have other opportunities to start looking at some of the worst roads in Carson City and bringing them up to reconstruct them in new standards. So we're currently actively looking at, go ahead, advance the slide, please. Let's skip this one. We're currently looking at a variety of factors to prioritize projects. And there'll be more to come at the Regional Transportation Commission on our next round of prioritized projects, and look for that at the June meeting. I think it's June 12th, if I have my dates correct. Projects do have a number of steps, and yeah, this is good, we can leave this slide. Projects do have a number of steps, and there is a number of costs associated with them. This slide here just shows general costs of what we're seeing here in Carson City. So in 2023, looking at all the costs we've received, it costs around $2.4 million to reconstruct 1 mile of road. $2.4 million per mile. Where we do preservation, we're looking at around $380,000 per mile. And these are based on prices that we've gotten from contractors who have done this work. So these are actual real world prices. And that's what we're seeing, 2.4 per reconstruction, 380,000 for preservation. So you can see the benefit there of preserving roads versus reconstructing roads. We can do a lot more for that dollar. Go ahead. So this is our final slide, just final thoughts here. We know our roads are deteriorating. Our revenue hasn't kept up with our expenses. We no longer have the sufficient funds to repair the roads we need to repair. We've been evaluating a number of mechanisms, not only now, but in the past, and trying to build those stories and build that history of how are we going to fund revenue, how are we going to deliver projects. Got 5 mechanisms we've been focusing on. It really takes a community like all of you and all of us who live here to solve these problems. And that's why, in part, why we're doing this and wanting to get that information. So with that, I think I'm going to end there, and let's do questions.
I've got two to start with, but like I said earlier, they were going to cover a lot of information there. So I'm sure some questions will come up and we'll sift through them. But as we keep talking here, come up with additional questions, and I'm sure if you think about it after tonight, write down your questions. We're looking for input as best we can. Okay, first one I've got here, overall comments on taxes for roads. The sales tax hits everybody that shops and buys here. And the property tax hits only property owners. The gas tax hits only vehicle owners. Question, what tax has been decided on, or do we get to vote on the tax? I think you've covered some of that already. You want to reiterate on again? Oh.
Is it working? Is it working? I don't know if it's working. Turn the switch.
How's that?
Test, test, test.
That
This one's
one's
working.
All right.
I'll say that nothing has been decided. We highlighted 5 mechanisms that we've been focusing on. As I indicated in the presentation, there are a number of,
I didn't touch anything.
It's a community microphone, that's right. There are a number of mechanisms, and pending direction from the Board of Supervisors, there could be 2 items placed on the November ballot, the government services tax and the sales tax. That direction has yet to be finalized, so that's coming. Look for that option in a coming Board of Supervisors meeting, but nothing else has been decided at this point.
Okay. I want to add a couple of points to what you had mentioned earlier, that the special improvement district tax, we essentially have that now for maintenance on South Carson Street. The property owners pay a little bit, and we're going to have something similar on William Street when that project is complete, correct?
That's correct. That does not pay necessarily for the road maintenance. That is to pick up the landscaping, all the improvements that went in outside of the road. That's not meant to cover the actual road maintenance.
Okay. And one of the other comments that had come up at our previous meetings when we were talking GID or property tax, who actually pays property tax now and who might be added to that overall property tax? From what I remember, the state of Nevada really doesn't pay property tax, but if you set your GID up correctly, they would be paying federal government as well for other property.
That's correct. It could, now they don't pay any property tax, but the GID could be written such that they be included in it, yes.
Okay, I'll go to the other question here. How will accommodation be made for residents of homeowners associations who already pay for their roads maintenance, HOAs? For their own? Yeah.
Well, since we're not maintaining, many HOAs have private streets, so we're not maintaining those today. So we wouldn't be accepting those or maintaining them in the future. So if something like the 2 sales tax options or the government services tax option were implemented, then you would pay those at those times when you purchased goods or services or purchased a vehicle. We wouldn't start or change anything we would be doing for private roads.
They wouldn't affect the GID. GID wouldn't pay.
And a GID would not pay, right? They'd be not affected because we wouldn't be maintaining those, correct?
All righty. We have a couple more questions. Oh, they're sifting through. It's okay. Like doing the Oscars here. Okay. Okay. How much funding did we receive from the federal infrastructure bill? Keeps changing.
So there's a number of discretionary grants that were authorized under the federal infrastructure bill. We've received some funding for some planning activities through the Safe Streets and Roads for All. That's not going to go toward road improvements, but we've received some funding for that. Otherwise, we haven't received we haven't been awarded any discretionary grants from the infrastructure law. There are formula funds, which are funds that are given to us regardless of, a grant, and we have received around $4 million in formula funding that can be used on roads specifically from the infrastructure bill.
And every time a bill passes, you guys are reviewing it to find out what we're eligible for. That's why we have monthly meetings between Campo and RTC to find out what's coming down the pike. Okay, next one. Is the city doing analysis to find out how the special purpose sales tax would impact lower income residents?
We're not currently looking at that detail. Sales taxes, I think, well, there was some analysis completed in one of the original reports that we had done as part of our local road funding initiative. That report's available online. It talks a little bit about equity in terms of impact to different users, low income being one of those. We're not currently looking at an equity analysis as part of our current effort, but that doesn't mean we couldn't.
Alrighty, that's another one. I think I've asked this in the past. Of the 5 possible funding options that you went over, which ones do not require a vote of the people?
The local improvement districts do not require a vote of the people. The general improvement district does not require a vote of the people. And the change to the plan of expenditures of the V&T sales tax does not require a vote of the people. That doesn't mean they couldn't have that, they just don't require it per state law.
Alrighty, thank you. Does Carson City have one of those machines that tears up the road in front, mixes it, and then repaves in the back, doing our own work with some special machines?
We do not. That's a very, very expensive machine, very cool, very loud. Yeah, it's too expensive. So when we do those type of projects, we would hire an outside contractor to bring that in.
Yeah, I think that gets back into what can city crews do and when do you have to contract out.
That's right.
If you were to get in the road paving business, how much more money would you need? Quite a bit.
And we do, from time to time, we kind of analyze that. What should we be trying to perform more work, and then at what cost, and do a benefit cost analysis between using contractors, low bids, or do we expand the ability of city crews to do more and place asphalt, to paver, that sort of stuff. So every 5 years or so, we look at that to see if there's any advantages that could be gained.
Yep, and I see the same thing with NDOT as well. They do what they can, but a lot of it gets contracted out. They have to. Okay, what is the city doing to cut non-essential expenses to find new funds to spend on roads before asking taxpayers again to pay more new taxes?
That's a great question. Anybody in the audience want to?
What can Public Works do?
Yeah, I can just speak, very broadly to that. As staff, we make our recommendations, but don't necessarily control those type of decisions. As part of our presentation, we did show where general fund is being transferred into help us with our street funding. More of that has happened lately than it even did before, so that there has been an uptick in that. And generally, that's just balancing the other services that the city provides. Our biggest expenditure, I think most people know this, is the funding of staff and services as it relates to our police department and our fire department. And so when you start looking at where could we move money and put it into roads, it doesn't take long to where we start affecting, whether it be parks, whether it be sheriff, whether it be fire, whether it be health. Those type of services make up the majority expense of our general fund. So if we're going to start moving money, those are the type of things that would be effective. So.
Okay, all right, thank you. I got a two-parter here.
Daily, I drive on West 5th Street from Crane to Division and north on Division Street to West Long Street. When will West 5th, North and South Division, and West Long Streets be resurfaced?
Well, I will say that on West Fifth, I'll start there. We are working on a project that's called the West Carson Vulnerable User Safety Improvement Project. Long name, but it does have elements of pavement preservation in addition to sidewalk replacement. This project was funded through a congressional earmark, federal funding, and so as part of that project, we do plan to do pavement preservation on a number of roads in that area of West Fifth. As well as Musser and Telegraph nearby as well. On Long Street, we're going to look at Long Street. West Long Street is part of our district rotation. It is classified as a collector road, so it's eligible for the funding that we have now, and it'll be up for consideration in our next round of project prioritization. And I don't know, what was the last street?
Oh, that was it. West Long, North and South Division, and West
Division.
5th.
Yeah, Division is going to be in that same boat as Long Street. We'll take a look at that the next round. We are over there, but 5th Street is a little bit more promising. So,
All right, here's the second part. We hadn't heard this term yet. Instead of hearing, there's no money for roads, when will we hear, we created a public-private partnership to improve so many miles of repair each year. PPP. I don't know if there's any private folks that want to.
will we accept donations, Darren?
Put a jar out. I would say public-private partnerships are really, they're really established for the bigger roads, the highways, the interstates, that sort of stuff, where they can go back and then to get their, private will invest, but they want payback. So those are the roads that have the tolls on them, that sort of thing. So if we're talking about local streets, I haven't heard of any mechanism or anybody doing any sort of a partnership with private to maintain local streets, because I don't see where they would get any way that they could get a return on their investment.
Right.
So
I guess what comes to mind for me is the new developments that go in, that put in new streets, built to the latest city standards, that become public roads.
Yes.
Right? And we get a few miles every year on that, roughly. And
We do, and so that if they build that road to city standards, and it's a road that is used for circulation within Carson City, then we generally will accept it. And then we've also been recently kind of experimenting with, after 5 years, when that first overlay goes down in terms of preservation, requiring the developer to also put that in as part of their project, so to extend the life of that road. So we've been experimenting and trying to get more of those into our development projects.
okay, good. And the last one I have at this point are new constructed roads made to newer technology, or are they prepared or replaced with the same old materials? In short, are there newer chemical compositions, newer materials? And
Absolutely. You want to go?
Yeah, there are new oils in particular is what comes to mind. Oils that are more resistant to heat and cold temperatures. They remain flexible. Colder temperatures, they remain stiffer at hotter temperatures. We require all new roads to use that newer oil. It evaporates slower, it's more flexible, as I mentioned. Whereas a lot of the old roads, the current roads in Carson City, use a much older version of that oil. The problem with that oil is it's only available primarily in the summertime, which is why we do the majority of our construction in the summertime, is because that's when those better materials are more readily available.
good. Have we ever considered doing any concrete intersections or concrete roads? I think RTC in Washoe has done some concrete. I know the cost is sky high, but have you guys considered that in any spot locations with heavy trucks or anything like that?
In my time here, I can just think of 2 cases where we actually considered it and looked at the design of what it would take and then the value added for it, and it didn't pencil out for us. There are certain circumstances where it is the right thing to do. I think you see it probably more in Washoe and Las Vegas area, just because of their truck traffic in a specific area where it would really benefit.
Right.
So we do consider it.
Good, good. I don't have any more written questions yet, but if you have any last call, or there's some more coming up. We got a couple more. Good. Made it through quality control. All right. Wish this was Valentine's Day. I'd be getting a lot of nice ones. Okay. What about new taxes from developments? Kind of what we were just alluding to. Are we considering any other options, or making developers pay more than they are right now?
Well, Darren alluded to the contribution for preservation. We're not able to do that on all of them, but we have gotten them on a few instances. We also are getting development, what we're calling our pro rata contributions, which, multiple developments over time are shown to cause an impact to a particular location or a particular intersection. And so we can collect a little bit of funding to make that improvement from a lot of developments. And so we can collect those, stockpile them, and then when it comes time to implement a project, whether that's a traffic signal or something like that, then we have the money available from those developments which cause the impact to implement the project. So we've got that on a number of locations in Carson City. In terms of an impact fee, we're not studying an impact fee for development as part of this project. I mean, that's always an option, but we're not looking at that at this time.
Okay. This one is kind of what we just talked about a couple minutes ago, but what are the cost savings of contracting out major road work versus doing it in-house, and what considerations go into deciding to do it in-house versus contracting?
Well, so for major projects, we already contract them out, and that is not handled by in-house staff. So that is already done. Like I say, we do look at return on investment for those projects, and should we change the model of what we're doing. So in-house, what we are doing is the crack sealing, the pothole filling, the small pavement patches, the majority of the concrete repair. That is being done in-house. And could you also contract that out? You absolutely could. It's not really, some agencies have gone to that in bigger cities, but as of right now, I wouldn't say it's a best practice for our size of a community, only because we get calls this time of year every day for pothole repair, and if you're paying a contractor to do that, they're not able to respond that quickly unless they have a crew just kind of sitting and waiting. So the cost won't benefit. Meanwhile, if our staff employee is not filling a pothole, well, he's working on something else that he can be working on, and then go fill a pothole. And so you kind of need a nucleus crew, and then you can grow from there or stay at that level. I think that's best practice for our size city.
Okay, a couple of things that I'd like to add to that is, we're talking about contractors and construction. Well, you have a lot of design work that consultants wind up doing, and that's pretty pricey too. But I've been surprised that Carson does enough design in-house that you can, and you guys make those decisions as well, right? So, okay. Okay, here's another one. What is your deadline to decide what are you going to do for the ballot question and voting? It sounded like the Board of Supervisors has to make that decision.
Yeah, I tentatively scheduled for April 18th on potential direction from the Board of Supervisors. That's the latest I've heard.
Yeah, we're kind of getting up in terms of the steps that have to take place before it actually ends up on the ballot. We're starting to push up against that. So that decision will have to be made within the next 30 days as to whether or not it's going to the ballot.
Okay, good. Good question, good answer. Okay. Does the city take into consideration the economy of scale when planning road maintenance projects? Can you give an example?
I love that question.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and I wish we could take advantage of economy of scale in much more detail. And given the limited dollars that we currently have, that sort of allows us to really only do 2 or maybe 3 projects per year for major reconstruction type projects. If we got additional funding, that doesn't mean we would do suddenly 6 or 7 projects. We just may do 3 or 4 larger projects. And so that's where the economy of scale really comes in. If you can have a contractor on site on a larger area and have flexibility to work with larger quantities, you're going to get a little bit more out of those dollars versus doing a lot of spot improvements. So definitely we consider it, and it's important. It's an important factor.
We have not maybe larger asphalt projects, but we have adopted a dig once policy. So if we are going to do a road, an area of a road improvement, we start looking at what's under the asphalt. So we try to put all utility work and asphalt projects, put them all at once in one area, so that we're not putting in a new roadway and then a couple years later digging that up and fixing the water line that's underneath there. So that does give us some economy of scale in terms of the overall cost of the project. It doesn't necessarily extend the asphalt a lot further, but we're trying to fix it once and then leave that area and do everything and be gone.
And when you do those projects, you use other funding sources as well.
Absolutely.
Right.
That work would not be paid for out of roadway funding. For instance, the water utility is going to pay to fix the water line. Sewer utility, same thing. Storm drain, et cetera, they pay their portion. Yep.
Okay. Another question on the GID. Why was the GID resurrected?
I don't quite understand. Resurrected from what?
I don't know. I think some folks said they didn't want it, and we're still studying it. That would be my version of resurrected. I know. We just passed Easter, so all of a sudden I go, whoa. And this used to be a church, I know.
We're gonna finish up the last analysis portions. We're working on the GID, specifically the assessment methodologies, so that we can have a complete picture of what a GID could or could not do or be, or how that would function, and then provide that summary, and then it would be up to the discretion of the Board of Supervisors or potentially voters on what to do with the GID. But we're just going to conclude that and provide the results.
Right, and you have a consultant helping you out on analyzing that stuff. I think this one we've covered, but it'll be in the backup material. What's the history of why we are so behind in road repairs? We've said no more than yes.
Yeah, I mean, to summarize a lot of the points that we made in the presentation is it's the cost to fix roads has risen, you could say exponentially, but the funding that has come in to fix roads has not. So that just over time, that gap has gotten longer, and everything that we do these days, it costs more money. We know that, and fixing roads just costs more money, and if there's not additional funding, then that gap's going to grow.
Right. I don't think we mentioned it specifically, but cars 20 or 30 years ago were not as fuel efficient as today.
Yep, good point.
I got a pickup that gets like 15 miles a gallon, so I'm doing what I can, but I
Thank you.
just don't drive that many miles.
No, that's it's part of the overall problem. Is it, our gas tax framework structure, was established so many decades ago, and it was based off of vehicles, 10, 12, 15 miles to the gallon. Well, now that they go 20, 30, 40, and some, 0 gallons, that model just no longer works.
Right. From my experience with FHWA, we used to have something called the Highway Trust Fund. When the interstate got going, we still have it, but it's supplemented by an equal amount from the general fund. So they haven't raised the federal gas tax in many years, but your income taxes and other things are paying for it. So, you try and find the money as best you can. I think this is the last one we have for now, in case there's more coming. When or if you generate double the revenue, say in 2026, will you be ready with enough administration and operations employees? Could you handle that additional work? It sounds like.
From a design and construction management side of things, we couldn't handle it. So we would be looking to hire design companies to help us design projects. We'd probably have to look at companies to help us manage the projects in terms of, are we getting the material we said we were getting? Are they putting it in the right spot? Are they doing everything right? We would need some additional support if we were to double our revenue source and project delivery. That being said, I think there is opportunities, as back to my earlier point about being efficient. More projects creates more need, but if we have larger projects, it doesn't necessarily equate to the same number of design or construction management staff. So there's flexibility there, and larger projects are definitely more efficient, as I mentioned.
Okay, we're back on a GID. Does the GID require new administrative expenses? I don't know if we can say that yet.
I think that's still a little bit to be determined. We'll probably have more of that in our final report as terms of recommendations on what it would take to administer a GID. So I'm not sure I have a full answer on that one at this point.
I think the general idea from what I've seen is we don't really want to create another layer of government. We would like to do it under the existing staff, because Carson City in my history has always been thrifty, or other words to that effect. But eventually you get what you pay for, and we need to just get a little bit more money to play with. Do we have any more at this point? Okay, we've been at it for just about an hour and a half, and I think it was a very good exchange of information. Hopefully you didn't get overwhelmed by the three engineers here throwing numbers and theories at you. But I think, the bottom line is there are options. None have really been decided yet. They've been doing a thorough job investigating all the options that are out there. And if anything comes up through the state legislature or elsewhere that would help Carson City, your folks are going to jump on it.
Absolutely.
So, any other closing comments? Okay, thank you. Okay, Marty, when